Most of us think freedom has something to do with choice. But some of the strongest limitations in our lives don't feel like limitations at all. They feel like preferences. And once something feels like a preference, we stop asking where it came from. When people start talking about invisible limitations, the mind usually reaches for big explanations. Systems, technology, politics, social media, things that sit far away from us. And those things matter. They shape the environment we move in. We have so much socially engaged art for a reason. But these limitations are not where this starts. Because no system can control you unless part of you is already cooperating with it. If something shapes your life every day without pressure, it won't look like control. It will look like routine. So when I talk about the matrix, I'm not talking about a system that traps you. I'm talking about patterns that keep running long after you stop choosing them. A habit begins as a shortcut, a way of saving effort. But once a behavior runs often enough without conscious choice, it stops feeling like something you do and starts feeling like something you are. I always do this, and eventually this is just who I am. That shift is small, almost invisible, and it's one of the quiet ways the matrix takes shape. Sometimes a limitation is real. You try something, you fail, and the failure makes sense. But what often goes unquestioned is what happens next. The situation changes, time passes, strength grows, and the conclusion stays the same. At some point, I couldn't becomes I can't. And eventually it becomes, this is just who I am. Not because it's still true, but because it was true once. I realized this recently in a very small way. I've never filled up at a manned gas station. I always choose unmanned ones. When I think about it, there's no real reason. I don't avoid people. I don't feel anxious about it. It just became the default. And at some point, I stopped noticing that I was still choosing it. Sometimes the matrix shows up in small social moments. Imagine a grandmother visiting after years of not seeing you. She speaks to you the way she always has, as if you're still the person you were back then. Nothing is wrong, nothing is unkind. But the interaction is quietly out of sync with who you've become. And without saying anything, you find yourself adjusting to the version of you she's addressing. I noticed this clearly when I started the job some time ago. I wasn't doing particularly well back then. I was quieter, less present. That's the version of me my colleagues learned to expect. Later, things shifted. Outside of work, I felt like myself again. But in that environment, the roles stayed in place. Partially because expectations had already been formed. and partially because I didn't really question them. I kept playing the role that had already been written. At the time, it just felt normal. Why does the Matrix feel comfortable? Comfort here doesn't mean pleasure. It means reduced friction. Habits lower cognitive load. Familiar roles reduce social risk. A fixed identity removes the need to check who you are today. Each of these saves energy. And energy saved feels sensible, especially when there's no obvious cost. The problem is that comfort doesn't ask whether the pattern still fits. It only asks whether it still works. And as long as it works well enough, it tends to stay. As long as these patterns reduce friction, they tend to stay in place. But friction doesn't disappear forever. Eventually, something begins to resist. A sense that the role no longer fits. That the habit feels too tight. And when that discomfort appears, we don't usually respond with clarity. We respond with movement. When something inside us starts to resist, we rarely stay with that discomfort. We reach for intensity. Historically, intensity came from rhythm, from repetition, from collective movement. Drums didn't tell people what to think. They told them when to move. They synchronized emotion. And in moments of uncertainty, that synchronization felt like certainty. Modern motivation works in much the same way. Modern motivation works in much the same way. It doesn't ask whether the direction is right. It asks whether you're moving. And movement can feel like clarity when you're unsure who you are. That's why motivational content is compelling. Not because it's shallow, but because it resolves tension quickly. It gives the nervous system something to do before it has to sit with uncertainty. And for a while, that feels like relief. You can see this pattern clearly in moments built around the idea of a fresh start. A shared agreement that this is when the change happens. The calendar shifts, and with it, identity briefly loses. For a moment, it feels easier to become someone else. Motivation feels effortless. Not because habits have changed, but because intensity is doing the work. And then, gradually, that intensity fades. Not because people don't care, not because they lack discipline, but because intensity was never meant to last. It creates movement. But movement alone doesn't rewrite the patterns it's trying to escape. Seeing these patterns doesn't free you from them. They still run. But something subtle changes. The moment before you react becomes noticeable. A small hesitation. Not long enough to plan, just long enough to realize a pattern is about to repeat itself. That pause isn't willpower. It isn't discipline. It's awareness interrupting momentum. And over time, those interruptions matter. In the workshop, you don't force materials into shape. You pay attention to where it resists. You notice grain, tension, direction. Working with the mind seems similar. You don't escape its patterns. You learn to feel them just before they take over. And you work from there.